I'm a humanitarian practitioner who dabbles in academia. So I've been in the humanitarian sector, working in the humanitarian sector for the last 25 years, mostly with the organization Doctors Without Borders, but I currently work as an independent consultant. So I work with many other organizations as well. I have a PhD in war studies from King's College London, and my normal topic of research is international NGO state relations, especially authoritarian regimes. But today I'll talk about mass. What did you call it? The title? Mass displacement. Mass displacement and population resettlement. I'm going to spend a few minutes on some basics, and then conceptual basics about the issue, and then provide some experiences from my own personal experience. If you work in anybody who works in the humanitarian sector will have done a lot of work on internally displaced peoples and refugees. But as you can hear from my accents, I'm actually a dual national, British and American, and I actually spent a bit of time with the American Red Cross in the States. So I have some experience of dealing with disaster management in the US as well, which I'll bring into the conversation. So I will be talking from a practitioner perspective. So this is a sort of information which a humanitarian organization or people from a humanitarian organization, whether working in a developed country or in Europe or North America, this is the way that we would think through the issue about mass displacement and population resettlement. So I gave a provocative title, what do you do when 300,000 people cross the border? That happens more often than you think. There have been very many cases over the last decades of mass displacement of people, and with the emphasis on mass. That doesn't mean that it's always at large amounts like that. Displacement can be a very small number of people. So it can be a very small displacement of people across a border, or internally displaced people. So in the humanitarian sector, we focus for quite a long time on refugees and refugee camps and refugee displacement. But over the last 20 years or so, there have been many more cases of internally displaced peoples. So civil wars, civil conflicts have become more common, and international conflicts have become less common. And so we deal with internally displaced peoples, IDPs, much more than we used to. So what is mass displacement and population resettlement? So the basics are the same everywhere. It doesn't matter whether it's Nigeria or whether it's Louisiana or whether it's the UK. The basics are the same. There's a need for, if you have a mass displacement of whatever size, of course, there's basic material support that's needed for the people, water, sanitation, food, shelter, medical aid, etc. People need those things everywhere, whether they're displaced or not, obviously. But if they're displaced, then of course they're not. It's up to aid agencies or disaster management officials from the countries to help provide these basic support to people who are not in their home. They have been displaced, and so these things need to be provided for them. And this can happen anywhere, as I say. I don't know if people remember Hurricane Katrina. I wasn't in the States at the time, but I remember looking at the pictures of the Louisiana Superdome. If you remember, there are all kinds of pictures of this. I don't know how many people who are living in the Superdome for quite some time. Atrocious conditions, lack of sanitation, a lack of basic material supports. So that can happen anywhere if the facilities of the ability of the local authorities to provide assistance is lacking, then you can get that sort of situation everywhere. For whatever reason, I used to live in New Orleans, and I know that New Orleans infrastructure in New Orleans is not very good, and I was not surprised that the authorities did not handle the situation very well. Pardon if any of you are from Louisiana. So that's one thing, basic material supports. And then there's what we refer to as protection needs. So that's about defining what the status of the displaced people are, whether it's an internally displaced person, whether it's a refugee, or whether it's somebody who has fled a disaster, any sort of a disaster. What's their status? Who's responsible for them? What are they responsible for themselves? And there are lots of issues about legal protection, especially for refugees, defining what their status is and the legal protection that they deserve. Quite big issues. If somebody is defined as a refugee or not defined as a refugee, that makes a big difference between to their legal position and how they're dealt with by the authorities. We have this issue in the UK currently, where the UK government has tried very hard to close off all legal avenues, almost all legal avenues for refugees to come to the United Kingdom. So if they're not considered to be a refugee, if they are not allowed to seek asylum, then they have no legal protection as a refugee. They are not an asylum seeker, and then they can be deported very easily by the government. Protection also relates to safety and security. Of course, safety is a big issue when you have mass movement of people. There are all kinds of course, safety issues concerning where they are actually, where they're housed, for example. Security is also a big issue. Security related to the host population, or the people from the place that the refugees have gone to, there are sometimes issues between them and the refugees. There's also, as I'll mention later, security issues within the refugee population itself, and that can apply to internally displaced people, and I think that applies to the survivors of Katrina in the Superdome. Lots of safety and security issues there. And one of the issues about the legal protection, especially if we're talking about refugees, is the issue of repatriation. We'll talk a little bit more later about the repatriation, but there's a whole set of international laws and international legal regulations about the system of repatriation. So it's quite important if a group of people have fled across the border and have become refugees, that they're given the proper status, and they're helped to keep the rights that they have as refugees to not be forcibly repatriated, that they have agency, that they have a choice for what happens to them. There's also legal rights that relates to concerning property. And I think this also applies to anywhere, any disaster, any population which has been moved because of a disaster. If they can't go home, then there's all kinds of issues about their property and what rights they have concerning their property. So options for if you take any options for any displaced population, there's always a question about what options that they have for returning home. But I want to talk a bit first about refugees, because that's a little bit more complicated. So when we talk about the options for displaced or for refugees, longer term options. What we talk about are what are called durable solutions. So durable solutions, there are three durable solutions. So it's a solution which is not an ad hoc short-term solution, but it's a solution which is durable from the perspective of the population and the individuals who are refugees. So there are three that we commonly talk about. There's voluntary repatriation. So that's when individuals or a whole population voluntarily decide that they are returning to their home country. So they fled across the border. They've been refugees, and they've been hosted as refugees in a third country, in the country, and then they voluntarily make the choice to return to their country. So that's voluntary repatriation. Of course, how voluntary is defined is a very tricky question. So there's always an issue. There's always an issue with how that concept is used and manipulated by, of course, especially by governments. People can be considered to be voluntary. A process of return can be considered to be a voluntary repatriation because people have made a choice that going back is the least worst case option for them, because staying as refugees in the host country has become untenable for them. So they made a negative choice. It's a negative voluntary choice. They have been forced in a situation where they have voluntarily returned to their country, but it's for a negative reason, because they've been forced out because of poor conditions, for example, poor conditions or security in the host country. So the nature of what constitutes voluntary repatriation is quite important. There's local integration. These are situations where the host country has allowed the populations to integrate as not necessarily as citizens, but as longer-term residents in the country, so that they stay in their host country and become set up their lives in the host country, and that there's a legal process to facilitate that. And then there's a third, which is resettlement. So resettlement means that the individuals or the population, they don't return to their home country where they fled from because the situation in the long term is not tenable for them. Their host country doesn't really want to host them forever. So then they become resettled in a third country. This resettlement, a process of resettlement is usually, because it involves a third country, is usually a bit more, it's a bit harder to arrange. It involves a lot more bureaucracy, a lot more, many more legal issues to solve. And it's usually dealt with by the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. And I mentioned the UK before, and the United Kingdom, for example, only takes people who are being resettled. So people cannot come to the UK to seek asylum. The only category of refugees that the UK takes is people who have been resettled. So they put a limit. They say we can take 10,000 Syrians. We'll take 20,000 Afghans, whatever, and then they take resettled people. And often people who have been resettled have to fit certain criteria. They have to fit certain criteria, and they have to be vetted from a security standpoint. So it's a cumbersome process. Resettlement, I should say, so these are all related to refugees, but you can apply these concepts also to any sort of mass displacement. Voluntary repatriation, it's a similar in a disaster. If you have a natural disaster, or not supposed to call it natural disaster anymore, right? Natural disaster. There is a certain point in time where people will choose to go back to their homes, but if it's been flooded or there's been an earthquake or there's been damage, they have to make a voluntary decision to go back to where they came from or not. And sometimes people make a choice to not go back. People cannot be forced to go back to their home. This is also the case for internally displaced people. If people are fleeing from one part of a country to another part of the country for their own safety, of course, they usually need to we usually apply the same sort of idea that they needs to make a voluntary decision to go back to where they came from in the country. Local integration, same thing. People have fled one area of the country because of a natural disaster or because of conflict or any sort of discrimination, and maybe they stay where they've been hosted. And resettlements, also sometimes people who have been discriminated against in their own country will not formally, but they will choose to resettle someplace else, will choose to leave the country and resettle someplace else, not as a refugee, but just for their own personal safety. I'll give an example of internal resettlement. After the U.S. invasion original invasion of Afghanistan, millions of refugees went to Pakistan and Iran and other places. But then there are also huge camps, especially in Pakistan. But there are also a lot of internally displaced people. And a lot of that happened based on ethnic lines. So there was a group of nomads and nomadic group of people who called the Kuchi, and the Kuchi were actually were from an area which was there's a lot of conflicts, and so there's a lot of problems with figuring out, because their nomadic migration, their internal migration patterns had been severely disrupted. So there's a lot of problems about where they could live in the country. And so one of the ideas that some in the international community came up with was to say, what they can just, they were linked to one ethnic group who is from one part of the country. So everybody said, well, they can just move to the other part of the country. That's not a problem. But of course, they did not want to move. They needed to be in the place that they were from. So that was not a voluntary resettlement. They resisted that, and they needed to be, with their preference, of course, was to be provided assistance so that they could live in safety and security in the part of the country which they were from, and have their migration routes reestablished. So it also happens when in internally displaced people, where people get told to move in another part of the country, and they are not given really a choice as to whether they do that or not. And of course, there's a long history of that in the U.S. in the Dust Bowl. I mean, a lot of the migration in the U.S. results, the Okies resulted from moving from one part of the country to another, because not voluntary movement, but forced to move because of the circumstances. There were a lot of issues in the 1930s in the U.S. about people moved on because they had to leave their home because their farms. A lot of people left Missouri, moved their farms. Their farms were no longer tenable, and they were asked to move on, and they were always pushed on, because nobody wanted them to settle in their part of the country. And so they got pushed on, and then they ended up in, so many ended up in California, which is actually what happened to my father as a child, moving from Kansas. So that's a segue into why do people move? Of course, there's conflict. A lot of the internally displaced situations and refugees are because of conflict. You can see that in the Ukraine right now. Of course, there are, I think the current number is 3 million have moved out of Ukraine into the neighboring countries. And they're, just think of a conflict and you will come up with a refugee movement. There's also persecution, discrimination, and persecution of one ethnic group or one religious group or one population for whatever reason they have been discriminated against and persecuted, either by their neighbors, by other groups in their part of the country, or by the government for one reason or the other. Darfur. The Darfur situation was a good example of that, with a lot of people moving. Internally displaced in Darfur, but then also a lot of people moved to Chad. So that was a mass displacement internally and internationally from Darfur. And then there's structural violence. And Diego, you could say a lot more about this than I can. But Latin America, Central America, structural violence, crime, lack of safety, the involvement of criminal groups. I believe a lot of the people who are moving from Central America up through Mexico into the U.S. A lot of that can be defined as structural violence. It's short of conflict. There's a situation short of conflict, but that definitely but definitely a violent situation, economically, personally, a violent situation for groups that cause people to move. And then there are natural disasters, quote unquote. You can think of many. Haiti, the earthquakes in Haiti. You can look at all the hurricanes in the Caribbean. You can look at the tsunamis. The most recent, bigger tsunami in Japan. That all creates a flow of people. Normally within the country, but it can also entail a flow of people outside the country, depending on where the natural disaster occurred and how big the mass displacement is. And then there, of course, what we call man-made disasters, famines, drought. Drought does not cause, lack of rainfall does not cause a famine. A famine and a drought are two different things. You only get a famine when the government has mismanaged the response to the drought. So Ethiopia, you can think of the various famines in Ethiopia that they have resulted in mass displacement within Ethiopia and many times over the years. There is the issue of statelessness. Statelessness it doesn't apply to too many groups. The one that's sort of more on the agenda, it's the last few years on the international agenda, but it's been on the humanitarian agenda for many years. The Rohingya from Myanmar, who are not considered to be citizens, but the Myanmar government does not consider them to be citizens. They're stateless. So when they go to a different country, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, then they become refugees, or they become classed as if they were refugees, but when they have an additional issue because they're stateless. So the Myanmar does not claim them. They're not claimed by the host country, so they have no state that they can claim that they're their own. So that adds an additional burden for that sort of group, and contributes to the reason why it's the impetus for them to leave the country in the first place. And most often it's a combination of two or three of those things. And most often it's not only one issue. There's a primary, a secondary, a cause and effect of all these different things: structural violence, persecution, conflict, statelessness. Palestinians, you can look at the situation in Palestine and look at that from a number of different perspectives, and look at then maybe all those factors contributes to the situation of the Palestinians. Okay, so I was going to give some examples. I will share my screen. I will have, and Diego's going to fix that.
Yeah, I just made you co-host, Andrew.
Okay. I was going to show some, it's often easier just to show pictures and talk around pictures. So everybody see that? Just going to give some snippets from different contexts. One of the things that I really want to get across is that when we think of internally displaced or disaster displaced or refugees, we often think of non-Western contexts, but that's clearly not the case. That conflicts or refugee flows only happen outside of Western context in the global South. So there has been, quite a scandal over the last number of years in Europe about how receptive the European Union has been to refugees, especially from Syria. I won't say too much about this, so you can look it up. But in effect, quite a few years ago, the European Union paid off Turkey for Turkey to host Syrian refugees. Europe did not want them to go to Europe, and so was perfectly happy to pay Turkey to host them. There were a number who got to Greece, though, and I'm speaking specifically of the Syrian context. Of course, Turkey borders Syria. Now, in Turkey, actually, as you can see, that nobody would choose to live in such a camp, but actually, the Turks always referred to their camps as 5-star camps, and in fact, they did provide some quite good facilities for the Syrian refugees. Now, sorry, I went backwards. But as I say, so before the sort of the inflow was stopped, inflow into Europe was stopped. There were a lot of, and partly because of the inflow into Europe and the lack of capacity for many European countries to deal with the refugees, that was when to sort of paid off to Turkey to keep the refugees in Turkey. But this is Greece. You can see the difference. Moria camp in Greece was abysmal, horrendous, unbelievable. That in one of the member states of the European Union, the conditions could be so bad. But one of the reasons why the conditions were so bad was because Europe did not want the refugees to be in Europe, and so they did not want to provide 5-star camps to the refugees. So actually, it's just notice that it's this plastic sheeting when it says UNHCR and what the little huts look like. So this is an aerial view. You can see how the situation was and what the conditions were. So this is Greece. I would also point out what happened in the previous administration in the U.S. Concerning the children of migrants on the border with Mexico, and how many children were forcibly taken from their parents. That's another case of a Western country not performing its responsibilities correctly. So I want to go back in time a little bit and talk about some situations of mass displacement that people may or may not have heard about. So this is these are refugees from Rwanda going into Tanzania. So if people remember, there was this was the Rwandan genocide. So this was This was a situation where the majority Hutu. This is a highly simplified story, but where the majority Hutu population, the leadership of the primarily Hutu population, which was in control of the country, perpetrated a genocide against the Tutsi population. During the genocide, the Tutsi rebel groups who had been living in Uganda took over the governments, and as a result, so the people who were responsible, not all the individuals, but the group that was responsible for the genocide, left Rwanda, and the group that was the subject of the genocide took over the government. So that the Hutu population then was, because they were considered to be the perpetrators of the genocide as a group, left the country in fear of what was going to happen when the Tutsi government took over the government. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of refugees left Rwanda into Tanzania, and also what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but then was still Zaire. Hundreds of thousands left in a very short time. Classic case of this was actually in just in a few days, in I believe 5 days, 350. So this is a Tanzanian side. 350,000 came across the border from Rwanda into the Ngara, this part of Tanzania. A classic case of mass displacement. So when you have a mass displacement, and you have a mass displacement of that many people, very, very, very hard to manage. I wasn't there in the first couple of months when there was the actual mass displacement, but I came into the situation after a couple of months. After there was this original camp was set up. But this is their first settlements. Helter Skelter, people created their own, these are called blendays, these little huts were called blendays, created these little huts all over the place, settled down, very poor infrastructure, and not an organized camp setting, but it's very hard to, at the spur of the moments, to host 350,000 people, and especially in a place which had not had too many refugees before. There had been some Burundian refugees in this area, but a very small number, 20,000, not 350,000. Camps have to be reorganized then after the first sort of flush of the movement is taken care of, and water and sanitation, emergency water, sanitation, medical aid is being given, then you have to put some organization into the camp. So all the camps were put into these lines. It's much easier to deal with camps when all the huts are standardized and they're put into lines. So there was and that took a very long time to reorganize the whole camp. So this was the Bamako after the reorganization. It was a massive camp. There was originally 350,000 people on this hill, and it had to be reorganized, restructured, and then you can see that. So the bigger camp was Bamako. You can see south of Bamako is Musahura, and then Lumasi. So these camps, Bamako was decongested, and new camps were created, organized well from the beginning, and so that the camps were rationalized, the populations were rationalized, and the camps, smaller camps were created. So that's a typical process for a mass displacement when you have hundreds of thousands of people coming at once. Now everybody was meant to be. You can see where the border is between Rwanda and Tanzania. Tanzania did not want the hundreds of thousands of people to stay in Tanzania, so they kept them at the border with the intention that when it was possible for them to return to Rwanda, that they could just be pushed back and returned to Rwanda. So they were kept right at the border. There are lots of safety and security. This was a case where the safety and security issues, the security issues were not about the relationship between the Rwandans and the Tanzanians. Actually, it was within the camps itself, because the genocidaires, the leadership, the leadership who was responsible for the genocide, and actually a lot of perpetrators, individual perpetrators of the genocide, of course, came across as refugees, and they retains their control over the population, and so there's a lot of security problems with people who are in the camps because of this. You always have a concern about cholera outbreak in these camps. We did not have a big cholera outbreak in these sets of camps. They did on the Zaire side, and tens of thousands of people died from cholera in the camps on the Zaire side. It was very bad. Okay, that was in the 1990s. Now we have this situation currently, which is a very similar situation. So Cox's Bazar, this is Bangladesh. These are the Rohingya coming from the Myanmar. There have been Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh for a long time, but there's always new waves of refugees. So another few 100,000 came over in 2015. And so this Cox's Bazar set of camps, which are already pretty big, but hadn't been there very long, grew massively. So there was needs to increase the capacity of the camps for an additional a few 100,000 people very quickly. They all came very quickly. But you can see it's a different terrain, a very hilly, much more difficult to settle people. This was not a top of a hill or a plateau. A very hilly, very wet area, so very difficult to set up a camp for hundreds of thousands of people in such a situation, especially looking at it from a water and sanitation standpoint. You can see the hills, and people are just settled wherever they could be settled. There is some sort of organization there. There's been a lot of attempts to settle people in the proper sort of organization from the beginning, so that it would be manageable. Just a closer shot of a very congested situation. But there is this hundreds of thousands of people in a fairly small area, so there's not room to decongest the camps. So very tightly, all the little huts are very tightly together, which means that you have problems like fires. This was after a fire a couple of years ago. Whole areas of the camps burned down because everybody is very closely together. Another example, I have a couple more examples. This is the Bidi camp in Uganda. So they're just South Sudanese refugees. Now you can see that there's more space. It's a plain, it's a savanna, and there's a lot more space. And Uganda has a different method of hosting the refugees. So mostly what countries do is they may host the refugees for many years. Kenya has been hosting Somali refugees in various camps for almost 30 years now. Hundreds of thousands of Somalis in what have become small cities, permanent camps for 30 years. But they remain refugees and they have very little rights. They have few rights in the host country. Uganda, for South Sudanese refugees, they have given them many more options for local integration. That doesn't mean that everybody will be able to integrate locally, but beyond having the chance to go back to South Sudan, they also have chances to stay in Uganda. So these aren't camps, actually. These aren't organized camps. These are settlements. These are settlements where people can temporarily settle themselves on what was land given to these communities for them to be able to settle themselves. I mean, there is food distribution, there's water and sanitation facilities, et cetera, but basically they settle themselves and they're allowed to settle and to continue to live there. So you can see that every little house, every little hut has its own little plot of land they can farm and they can conduct business, et cetera. So it's easier for the South Sudanese and Ugandans to locally integrate than in many places. South Sudan is an interesting situation because actually one of the reasons that Uganda has such a favorable view over the settlements of refugees is because Uganda and South Sudan have traded refugees multiple times over the years. When there was a civil war in northern Uganda, many Ugandans were hosted in South Sudan. So the Ugandans and the South Sudanese say, you know, we've each hosted each other. So in situations where we need to host you, we will do that because we know that in the future, there's a potential that you will have to host us. So it's a good neighbor policy to host each other when there's conflict in each country. South Sudan is a good example of a situation where there have been various peace agreements over time, but there's not a lack of conflict. That's never translated into a lack of conflict. So that these South Sudanese in Uganda, they want to go home. Most of them are from just across the border in Eastern Equatoria or Central Equatoria in South Sudan, but they don't trust the peace. There's not safety and security. They don't want to leave they don't want to leave the situation that they have in Uganda to go back home if it means that they will have poorer conditions at home, a lack of safety and security, and not knowing if they can return to Uganda. Some people actually go back and forth. So it's an unsettled situation for many of the refugees because they don't know what the correct choice to make. They do want to go home, obviously, but they only want to go home when they know that there's actual security and safety at their home. Another picture of the bitty camp. You can see how much space there is and how it's everything is put into blocks. So each of these there's a little paths, and each of these is a little block, much less congested than most of the other camps that I showed. So I will stop sharing my screen. Yep. Okay. So just to summarize, so there are different solutions. The reasons for movement are different, of course, and there are different solutions to how to deal with durable solutions to the needs of the populations who have been displaced. Different options for settlement. The type of aid is different. I mean, in some of the, like in the bitty camp I just showed you, of course, and the water is provided through pumps, hand pumps, or drilled wells, and there are latrines. Okay, that's not going to be the situation for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians who are going to Slovakia or Poland or Hungary, of course, or Germany or any place else in Europe, of course, they're being housed. They're refugees, but they're being housed by people. They're not going into camps. So, but regardless of where they're going, they still have the same basic needs. How are they going to pay for food? Who's going to pay for food, medical care? What's their legal status? How long can they stay? What is the prognosis for how they would return home? So these are all natures of the crises are different, but the basics are the same. And unfortunately, there's no shortage of reasons for mass displacement. Mass displacement continues. I didn't talk about the climate emergency displacements. That's a whole different issue about whole populations that will, whole populations that in the future will move and become displaced simply because where they come from is no longer tenable because of temperatures, because of lack of rainfall or too much rainfall. And there are already some places, and for example, in Pakistan, a couple of years ago, there was in the southern Pakistan, Sindh province, there's a certain temperature at which it's untenable for people to continue to live in a place. And there was a situation a couple of years ago where there's a section of a Sindh province where the temperature was reached that critical or that red line, and people were actually displaced for a period of time because they could not physically live in that. And so that's going to happen more and more. So climate displaced people are going to, that phenomenon is going to increase. So that's the end of my ranting and babbling, and